Hello, Mr. K here again. We are continuing our engine overhaul series, and now we're continuing reassembly. And we're going to talk about some different parts of reassembly today. This is a little bit more challenging of a part of reassembly. We're not just cleaning anymore, and we're not just measuring. We're now doing a little bit of math too. So let's jump in here. Okay. We're going to be talking about a few things today, but torque to yield bolts is a big one, and also oil clearance. And then we'll touch a little bit on gaskets also. All right. So we're talking about torque to yield bolts, or TTY bolts, as a lot of people call them. Talk about plastic aging, measuring oil clearance, and gaskets. The general rule is never reuse a gasket. However, that's not always what you have to follow. If you're trying to save money, I'm going to give you some tips and some ways you can reuse gaskets, and some gaskets that you never want to reuse no matter what. All right, go ahead and pause my video at this time and watch this one. It talks about torque to yield bolts. Okay, you should just watch that video on torque to yield bolts. Tells you a little bit about how bolts stretch as they tighten, and that helps them lock down and makes them a little more secure than the old-fashioned bolts that don't torque to yield. And we're going to show you a video also about how to fasten those torque to yield bolts, because it's a little different than just using a torque wrench. So at this point in time, go ahead and pause my video and watch this one. Okay, should just watch that video. Shows you how to use a torque angle gauge and torque to yield bolts. All right, so torque to yield bolts, as you saw in the video, typically have a torque like 50 foot-pounds, and then they have an angle. So if you look up the torque value of a cylinder head bolt for a certain engine, and it has that type of bolt, it may say torque to 55 foot-pounds, then 95 degrees. So you have to have both a torque wrench and a torque angle meter, or else you can't install those bolts properly. I would venture to say engines newer than about 1995, maybe 2000, you start getting into more of this torque to yield stuff. Older than that, generally they don't have torque to yield bolts in my experience, but that's kind of the era when it starts occurring. Some people say you can always tell a torque to yield bolt by looking at it and seeing if it's got this little shoulder here. I don't know that I buy into that. I threw that picture up there just for reference. Some people say, oh, you can tell if it's a torque to yield bolt if it has a captured washer, which is a washer that will not come off the bolt. It's either part of it, like it's welded to it, or molded to it, I should say, or no matter how hard you pushed, you can't get it past the threads. People say, oh, that's a torque to yield bolt. I don't know that I trust that. I've seen bolts with captured washers that are not torque to yield bolts. I mean, they're holding on water pumps and valve covers and stuff like that, you torque them to 8 foot-pounds, not a torque to yield bolt. So I don't know that I trust that, but I threw that up there. It is something people say. I think it's accurate most of the time, or maybe over 50% of the time. Anyway, torque to yield bolts stretch when you tighten them. As a general rule, you don't want to reuse them. However, some manufacturers allow you to retorque them again. The most I've ever seen is 5, and that was Chrysler 4 cylinders allow you to torque their bolts 5 times. However, the 5-time rule, maybe they've gone away from that, but back in about 2015 or so, they had said you could retorque their torque to yield bolts on their engines up to 5 times. So they're torqued once at the factory. Okay, let's say you pull the engine out, you take it apart, then in the process of having it apart, you want to check main bearing clearances. So you pop the main caps on, you torque them again. Now that's 2 times. You have to pull it back apart then to insert the crankshaft, or clean it, insert the crankshaft, and then you torque it again. That's 3 times. Hopefully that's all it ever needs to get torqued. But if you realize you messed something up, or the crank doesn't spin well, loosen it again. Now you're running down the clock. So But I've never seen that anywhere else. It was just Chrysler that said you could torque it 5 times. Most manufacturers just say once. And if you loosen them, you're buying new bolts. So just know that. Okay, like I said, you got to use a torque angle gauge to get the final torque. And they supposedly hold high vibration components more securely throughout the lifetime of the vehicle. I think it's a money thing more than anything for manufacturers, that they can make a skinnier bolt with less material that saves them money, and they just change the way that it's torqued. That's my personal opinion. I mean, I'm sure they hold better in some scenarios, but I think part of it is just manufacturers saving money because they can use a skinnier bolt. Okay, so that's torque to yield bolts. Now let's talk about oil clearance, bearing clearance. So if you think back to many moons ago when we talked about how oil flows through bearings, especially plain bearings like this, like a cam, crank, rod bearing, there's just a film of oil between the part that moves and the bearing. And wherever that film of oil is the thinnest, you still don't want it to have metal to metal contact right here, right? So but there's going to be a tiny layer of oil there, hopefully, while the engine's running. If there's not, then the engine's going to destroy itself pretty fast. That is called your oil clearance, or your bearing clearance, oil wedge thickness, whatever you want to call it. But that's, if you pull up your overhaul manual for whatever engine you're working on, it'll specify that. And most of the time it's going to be somewhere between 1/2 thousandth of an inch and maybe 2/1000ths of an inch. I've heard of engines going higher than that when they're running 2050 oil and running 8,000 RPM and stuff like that. But most of your street vehicles, about 1/1000th of an inch to 2/1000ths of an inch. Okay. So if you remember, the act of that jumping up, as that spins, it's going to jump up on that oil layer and ride on it so it doesn't actually touch this. That's called the viscous oil wedge, or the hydrodynamic effect, or the water ski effect, as I like to call it. Think of a water skier going fast enough to jump up on the water. Okay, we talked about the thin layer of oil. Talked about that. So if that layer of oil is too thin, that metal is going to break through the viscous oil wedge and grind against the bearing. And then you have metal to metal contact, and that's very bad. Of course, your engine's probably going to last no more than 20-30 minutes, depending on the conditions. So can't have it too thin. So you can't have that bearing being too tight on the crankshaft, for example, or the camshaft, because it'll be too thin. Now, if it's too thick, the oil will just dump out. Let's say, this is kind of exaggerated photo, but let's say it's this thick all the way around. That oil is just going to dump out of there. It's not going to really hold the oil in there. So you'll get lack of lubrication, but you're also going to get a leak in your oil system, essentially, and that oil is just going to dump right back down in the oil pan. That is kind of like if you have a garden hose and you're trying to get high pressure out of it and spray it really fast at the nozzle, but all of a sudden you realize you didn't screw the nozzle on all the way, and it's dumping water out from the base of your hand where your wrist is at, kind of that lower part of the hose is dumping a bunch of water out. Well, you're not going to get very much pressure at the tip of the hose because you're losing all your pressure somewhere else. Same thing here. You're going to lose all your pressure here, and it's not going to get past the cam bearing or whatever this is to the other bearings because it's all the oil is dumping out right there. All right, go ahead and pause my video at this time and watch this one on how to measure main bearing clearances in an engine. Okay, you should have just watched that video. That's a good video on how to measure main bearing clearances. That is the by the book, most right way to do it, I would say. That's what race engine mechanics, engine builders are going to use. That's what, if a guy's overhauling a Ferrari or Lamborghini engine, that's what he's going to do. Airplane mechanics, that's what they do. That's a good way to do it. Takes a long time, takes a lot of patience, a lot of documentation. So here's the way a lot of backyard mechanics do it, or guys that just don't have the time to do it the other way or don't want to mess with it. and they're not building a race engine or an engine for a Ferrari. Here's the way they're going to do it. Go ahead and watch this video. Okay, should have just watched that video. So what he used is a plastic gauge, and it's basically just a wax string that you lay across whatever it is you're about to torque. Then you would lay that bearing cap back down over this, torque it. It's going to smash that wax string out. Take your bearing cap back off. Remember, if you got torque to yield bolts, you just blew a torque to yield sequence there. You've just worn out your bolts a little bit more. Keep that in mind. Anyway, you pull that bearing cap off, it's going to be smashed. Now you just use this little card to measure how smashed it is, and that will tell you what your oil clearance is for that bearing. So simple and fast, but of course it's less accurate. And there's what they look like up close. Okay, I don't believe in these. I don't use them, but I know people that do and don't have any issues with them. So it's an option. Okay, let's talk about gaskets. A lot of different kind of gaskets out there. You're going to be dealing with a lot of gaskets if you're overhauling an engine. And there's some rules to remember. We talked about removing gaskets. Remember, if you're working with an aluminum block or head, you don't want to use a steel scraper. You don't want to use anything too abrasive because you're going to end up removing aluminum also, not just the gasket. But also, let's talk about reusing gaskets, because sometimes we don't have all the money that we wish we had when we're building our engines. And if you need to cut corners somewhere, reusing gaskets is something you can do in a pinch. So let's talk about which ones you can reuse and which ones you can't. So general rule is don't reuse any gasket, right? Most manuals will tell you not to reuse gaskets at all, except for one type of gasket. And what do you think that is? Ponder that for a second. There is your hint. Oil drain pan, okay? When you're changing oil, some manuals will say replace it every time. Some of them will say replace it every 2 oil changes, replace it every 5 oil changes, replace it every, I think I've seen up to 8. Or some of them say just replace it if it's leaking or if it appears severely smashed or cracked. But there is some allowance for reusing those. Oil drain plug gaskets. Okay, let's learn a little more about gaskets here. Go ahead and watch this video. All right, you should have just watched that video. He talked a little bit about a newer style gasket, multi-layer steel gaskets, and about not reusing those. And I definitely agree with that. All right, so if you have to reuse gaskets, here are some basic rules. This is from a lot of reading and from just personal experience and that type of thing. What kind of gasket is this? First of all, can we reuse it? No, I'm going to say don't reuse these. This is a cork gasket. Generally, once you torque these down and smash them, they're smashed forever. They don't recover, and they'll never seal again very well. So I would not reuse a cork gasket. What kind of gasket is this? Hopefully you said rubber. And I'm going to say reuse it. As long as you've inspected it and it's not full of cracks and it's not super brittle, you could reuse this. And in fact, I reuse these a lot if I can. And very, very, very rarely do I get one that leaks, that bites me like that. So saved a lot of money by reusing rubber gaskets. How about these? Just watch the video on it. I would say don't reuse these. These are steel gaskets or stainless steel, but don't want to reuse those. Once they're smashed, they're smashed. This is a, well, asbestos gasket. I'm going to say don't reuse that either. Similar thing, once asbestos, once it's smashed, it's smashed. How about this guy? Copper. And again, the manuals are going to tell you don't ever reuse them. However, if you do enough reading and you ask enough old school mechanics, they'll tell you you can generally reuse these once. So you torque them down, they're torqued down at the factory, whatever it may be. Your engine runs 50,000 miles. Let's say you pull the head off. As long as the gasket looks decent, usually you can bolt it back down once on a copper gasket. Again, not recommended, but you can get away with it most of the time. All right, at this point, go ahead and complete your assignment and have a good day.